This is lesson 4.4 on exploring percents. Before watching the video, please make sure that you have either your math journal or a graph sheet of paper or a sheet of paper in front of you, along with a pencil, some different colored pens, and perhaps a highlighter as well. So if you need to pause the recording to get those items, please do so now. I should also tell you that while watching this video, I do encourage you to write down the notes and to pause the video when I ask you to figure out some questions. The only parts of the video where I wouldn't expect you to recopy on your own page is where I have a hundredths grid as I do right here. I wouldn't expect you to recopy the hundredths grid on your own page, but so you can just record the notes that go along with the hundredths grid as well. And plus, this video is on YouTube for your reference if you need to go back and refer to it. Now, I'm just going to continue. Again, make sure you have today's date written down, and the title is 4.4. So the lessons leading up to this had to deal with fractions and ratios, and percent is the final topic in this unit. And actually, percent has a great connection to both fractions and ratios, because percent, if you look at what a percent means, it is actually a ratio out of 100. So you can jot that down. That's one definition. Now, oftentimes you see it expressed as a percent symbol, but it's actually a ratio out of 100. That's what a percent is. And actually the word percent actually means per 100. Especially if you remember your French, you can go back to your French. The word cent means 100 in French, so it's per 100. Okay, percent is also a fraction out of 100 too. So when you see the percent sign, you automatically know that that number is expressed as a fraction out of 100. So let's use this hundredths grid as an example to go over what percent means. So what I'd like you to do is think to yourself and count how many squares are shaded in this hundredths grid. We know that, so this is going to be the first example. Actually, I'm going to do this in a different color here. So in the first example, we know that 27 out of 100 squares are shaded. So, part A. So express that as a fraction over 100. So we know that 27 out of 100 represents the amount of squares that are shaded in the hundredths grid. We know that 27 out of 100 as a percent is 27%, because 27% represents the fraction over 100. So that is an easy conversion. Once you see 27 out of 100, you can automatically express that as a percent. It's 27%. And vice versa, 27%, we know that that's expressed as something out of 100. So we know the equivalent fraction is 27 out of 100. Now, the other way in which we see percents and fractions being expressed is the decimal equivalent as well. So what we do is we know that with the hundredths grid, 1 represents 1 whole. So we know a fraction, or the decimal equivalent of that whole, is 27 hundredths. Okay, we know 27 hundredths is equivalent to 27 out of 100 because it's less than 1 whole. And we know that that equivalent percent is 27%. So we know that the decimal equivalent of 27 out of 100 is 27 hundredths. So remember, this is 27 hundredths. If you think back to when we learned about decimals and decimal place value, a couple of units ago. Okay, so those are the three ways in which you should be able to express percent. So you're being able to express the number as a fraction out of 100, as a percent, and as a decimal. So this is how we're describing the shaded part of the hundredths grid here. Okay, let's go with another example with the hundredths grid. So again, please do not try to recopy the hundredths grid that I'll bring up here. Just simply jot down the notes that go along with it. Okay, so actually, instead of doing that, let's do actually the percent of the grid that is unshaded. So let's do this in a different color. Okay, so that will actually save us doing another hundredths grid. Now, if we look at this hundredths grid here, we know that if 27% of the squares are shaded, I want you to pause the video and figure out and follow along with the same process as we did in the first example. I want you to pause the video and figure out the percent of the squares, I'm going to outline in blue, that are not shaded. Okay, so obviously this number plus 27 has to equal 100. So I want you to pause the video now and think about that. So what is the percent of the squares that are not shaded? And if you can move on to the same process as we did for A, B, and C in the first example, what is this expressed as a fraction over 100? What is a number expressed as a percent? And what is a number expressed as a decimal? So go ahead and pause the video and do that. Okay, so we know that the remaining number of squares that are not shaded are 73. So we know that 73 out of 100 squares are unshaded. Okay, so again, following the example above, we know that this expressed as a fraction over 100 is 73 out of 100. So double check if you moved ahead with your answer there. Okay, part B. So what is this 73 out of 100 expressed as a percent? We know that anything out of 100 can be expressed as a percent because percent means per 100. So this again represents, I'm just jotting this down again so that you have a good understanding of what percent means. It represents the fraction over 100. And then C, okay, so express 73 out of 100 or 73% as a decimal. We know that 73 out of 100 is the same as saying 73 hundredths because it is less than the whole. So 1 whole is 1, represented as a decimal as stated up there. And we know that 73 hundredths represents 73 out of 100. Okay, so that's working with the hundredths grid there. So make sure that you understand how to express a fraction over 100 and that equivalent value makes it become the percent, and understand how we get the equivalent decimal for that as well. It might be good to go back to the previous unit where we dealt with decimal place values so you remember the meaning of hundredths. Okay, so I'll move on to a couple of more questions here dealing with converting from and moving from a decimal, percent, and a fraction. So let's go with, let's do this in another color. Let's do pink. So here's another example of something that may come up. I'd like you to write as a percent and as a decimal. So we'll go with 2 questions here. Okay, so let's do example A in pink. let's do 16 out of 100. And if you want to pause the video at this point to figure out what the percent is and what the equivalent decimal is of 16 out of 100, please go ahead and do so. The next one is 3 out of 100. So again, if you want to pause the recording, go ahead and do that. I'm going to continue. So I know 16 out of 100 automatically as a percent, because percent means per 100, is 16%. I know as a decimal, it has to be 16 hundredths because it's less than the whole. So 16 hundredths is the equivalent of 16% and 16 out of 100. So 3 out of 100, I know as an equivalent percent because it's already per 100 is 3%. Now this is where you have to be careful. Some people make the mistake, and that's fine, but just make sure that you're aware of the difference. They think that the equivalent decimal is 3/10 or 30 hundredths. Now I want you to think to yourself, why do you think why is this not the case? Why is 30 hundredths or 3/10 not equivalent to 3%? Think about it. We have 3 out of 100. We only have 3 out of 100, which means we actually only have 3 hundredths. So remember, this represents the decimal 3 hundredths, which is what we want. And this represents 30 hundredths. Now 30 hundredths is actually equivalent to 30%, not 3%, because that would be 30 over 100. So we actually don't want this. 3% is equivalent to 300. So make sure that you understand that difference. Okay, let's do a couple of more where we're going from a percent to a fraction and a decimal. Let's go with green for the next part here. So here's another example, 2 examples. So write as a fraction and as a decimal. Okay, so first example here, and again, I encourage you to pause the recording as well. Let's go with 7%. And then the next example, let's go with 93%. Okay, so I encourage you to pause it, figure out what the equivalent fraction is for both percents and the equivalent decimal is for both percents in green. I'm going to continue. So as a fraction, well, I know that 7% as a fraction is per 100 already because it's expressed as a percent. So I know it's automatically 7 out of 100. Okay, now as a decimal, this is similar to the example B in pink above where we had 3%. Now we have 7%. So think carefully as a decimal, what would it be? So I'm thinking 7 out of 100 is equivalent to 7 hundredths. So it's going to be 7 hundredths expressed like that. And again, think to yourself really carefully, why is it not this? Well, I know it can't be that because that would be equivalent to 70 hundredths or 70%, and that's not the equivalent decimal that we want. We want 7 hundredths. Okay, so make sure again that you know that distinction. For 93%, we know that it's already a percent, so it's a fraction out of 100 already, so that's 93 over 100. And because it's less than the whole, it's less than 1, we know that the equivalent decimal is 93 hundredths. You might have examples where you could simplify the fraction. So here's a challenge here. I'm going to give you 15%. Now I want you to pause the recording if you'd like, follow the same process. Express 15% as a fraction and then as a decimal, and then see what you come up with. Okay, I'm going to continue. Now, as a fraction, 15% is, well, we know percent per 100, it's automatically a fraction over 100. But whenever you have the opportunity to simplify a fraction, you should go ahead and simplify the fraction. It's also good practice with applying your division, and also good practice with applying your LCM, or your lowest common multiple. So we know when we look at 15 over 100, we can simplify it because both the numerator and denominator, if I think to myself, they're both divisible by 5. 15 divided by 5 is 3, and 100 divided by 5 is 20. So the equivalent fraction of 15% actually reduces to 3 over 20. Now, as a decimal, we go back to the original, 15%. We know it's less than the whole. 15 over 100 is the same as 15 hundredths. So again, if you have the opportunity to simplify the fraction, go ahead and do so. It's a good practice to do that. If you can't simplify it, obviously leave it as the fraction over 100. So just to review what we've covered today, we talked about percent. So we know that percent, in terms of its definition, is a ratio out of 100. And oftentimes we see the percent symbol being used, and that means per 100, the word percent is. So whenever we see the percent sign, we know that number is automatically a fraction over 100. We looked at the hundredths grid here. We did some practice in expressing the number of shaded parts and unshaded parts as a fraction, as a decimal, as a fraction, as a percent, and as a decimal. So make sure you understand how to move between the 3 different forms. And then we looked at more equivalent forms too. We started off with the fraction over 100 in the pink part here. We expressed it as a percent and then as a decimal. Be careful when you have something that's less than 10, because we always have to think about what it actually means in terms of the decimal. So for example, 3 out of 100 actually means 3 hundredths, not 30 hundredths. Here in the bottom example, we had percents, and then we moved from a fraction to a decimal. Again, if you have the opportunity to simplify a fraction in its lowest terms, please go ahead and do so. And that's it for lesson 4.4.